Matthew 23:15 reads, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves." Within its context, Jesus is not condemning the idea of conversion itself. The existence of proselytes confirms that Second Temple Judaism had a recognized mechanism for incorporating non-native individuals into Israel's covenant life. That point is difficult to dismiss, even from a bloodline-only perspective, because the text assumes the category rather than questioning it. A common counter is that proselytes were rare or only superficially included, but even if that were granted, the critique in this passage still presupposes that such inclusion was real enough to be meaningful. The issue, therefore, is not whether inclusion existed, but how it was being handled. The force of the statement is that the Pharisees are zealous in making converts, traveling land and sea, but the result is corruption rather than covenant faithfulness. Even if one argues that the language is rhetorical or hyperbolic, hyperbole here intensifies real activity, not imaginary categories. One does not exaggerate what doesn't exist. So, at minimum, the text reflects an environment in which efforts to gain proselytes were known. The problem Jesus identifies is that instead of forming faithful participants in Israel's covenant, the Pharisees reproduce their own distortions, hypocrisy, legal imbalance, and misplaced priorities, so that the convert becomes twice as much a son of hell. This actually reinforces the covenantal framework rather than contradicting it. The problem wasn't that proselytes existed, the problem was that the leadership responsible for forming them was corrupt. If Israel were strictly bloodline only, the text would only make sense if proselytes were treated as meaningful participants within Israel's covenant life, not as irrelevant outsiders. In other words, there would be no category for a non-Israelite becoming a proselyte in the first place. But the text assumes that category and only critiques misuse of the practice, not the practice itself. So Matthew 23:15 does two things at once. It confirms that covenantal inclusion of outsiders was a real and recognized practice, and it condemns the failure of Israel's leaders to bring those converts into genuine covenant faithfulness. It's not a rejection of inclusion, it's an indictment of corrupted leadership within the covenant system. Scholars also affirm that proselytizing activity, in the sense of attracting and incorporating non-Israelites into Jewish life, was a real and fairly widespread feature of Second Temple Judaism, including among groups like the Pharisees. It's not usually framed as an organized missionary program in the modern sense, but there is strong evidence that Jews actively gained converts and God-fearers across the Mediterranean world. For example, Louis H. Feldman is one of the most frequently cited scholars on this point. In Jew and Gentile in the ancient world, Attitudes and Interactions from Alexander to Justinian, he writes on page 288, Judaism was a missionary religion. It attracted a large number of converts and sympathizers. Feldman compiles extensive literary, archaeological, and inscriptional evidence showing Gentiles attending synagogues, adopting Jewish practices, and in some cases undergoing full conversion, concluding that the number of proselytes and God-fearers was very considerable. Similarly, Craig S. Keener, in Acts, an Exegetical Commentary, Volume 2, notes that diaspora synagogues regularly included Gentile adherents, God-fearers, who were drawn to Jewish monotheism and ethics. He writes, synagogues in the diaspora attracted not only Jews but also Gentiles who were interested in Jewish monotheism and ethics. While Keener avoids overstating a formal missionary system, he affirms that Jewish communities, including those influenced by Pharisaic teaching, functioned as centers that drew non-Jews into their religious orbit. N.T. Wright also acknowledges this dynamic. In his work, Paul and the Faithfulness of God, he observes that Judaism in Paul's day was not simply a racial or ethnic grouping, but a community defined by covenant, Torah, and the one God, and that it welcomed Gentiles who were prepared to abandon idolatry and accept Israel's God pages. Wright highlights that the widespread presence of God-fearers and proselytes across the Roman world reflects an outward-facing dimension of Jewish life, even if it lacked centralized missionary structures. At the same time, scholars consistently add an important qualification. Judaism was not uniformly or aggressively missionary in the way later Christianity was. As Feldman himself notes, there was no organized missionary movement comparable to that of early Christianity. Conversion typically occurred through attraction, synagogue life, ethical monotheism, and community influence, rather than systematic outreach campaigns. That said, Matthew 23:15, where Jesus describes Pharisees traveling land and sea to make one proselyte, is widely taken as evidence that at least some Jewish groups did engage in intentional efforts to gain converts. So the scholarly consensus isn't that Pharisees ran a global evangelistic movement, but it does affirm that proselytizing, both formal conversion and informal attraction of Gentiles, was a known and meaningful part of Jewish life in that period. That aligns directly with the New Testament portrayal of proselytes like Nicholas and God-fearers like Cornelius, outsiders not biologically related to Abraham, who were treated within the text as legitimate participants in Israel's covenantal world.